I've been around the medical block for a long time, and the best advice I've heard on how to be a good doctor came long ago from a colleague I respected. It's so simple that it will never appear on any exam board or any clinical guideline, and yet it's also so profound that it can be compared with playing Mozart, which has been described as too simple for beginners and too difficult for virtuosi. We were chatting after consulting over a young hyperthyroid patient who was in a thyroid storm and who would need an eventual thyroidectomy. My colleague said, good doctors worry about their patients. It was an offhand comment, but it caught my attention because it's so much in so few words. Doctors who worry about their patients keep up to date, listen to their patients, and think about not only what they said, but also what they haven't said. They second guess their own impressions because they are aware of the potential for error, as I discussed in my September column. More than adherence to clinical guidelines or being paid for performance and recertification, the combination of good medical training and worrying about one's patients is likely to lead to the highest quality care. Obviously, this flies in the face of the entire movement toward accountability and outcomes analysis, the underlying premise of which is that only measurable results count and not soft and fuzzy platitudes. I don't disagree, but it should be obvious that there isn't enough time or money to measure everything, and that what is measured is a proxy for everything that isn't measured. We ultimately take it on faith that doing well in one thing or two or three or whatever is reliable guide on how we treat everything else. It's convenient to think so, even as we have to acknowledge that it's very naive. The less competent doctor worries most about himself or herself. Will I botch the case, lose the patient, get sued? Fear may be a motivator to perform, as malpractice lawyers never cease to remind us. Better yet is worrying about the patient. That puts the patient and not the doctor in first place. It's a different mindset, one that's likely to lead to a host of good behaviours, ranging from keeping up with the journals to avoiding snap and uncorroborated judgments and consulting with colleagues in the face of uncertainty. In my opinion, it's the patient's greatest guarantee of safety, no matter that it will be elicit big yawns from consumerists and the healthcare management industry. Putting the patient first really is a risk these days, because while everyone pays lip service to it, it's harder and harder to implement in a managed care environment. Patient advocacy risks pitting the doctor against everyone else. This may even include other doctors who have their own agendas to pursue. Hospitals, for example, as well as the usual suspects, insurers, the government, and their intermediaries. Our age of unbridled capitalism also cynically exploits and denigrates caring, which is very close to worrying. Witness the routine and meaningless "we care about your call" that comes in on automatic phone response, usually as a prelude to an interminable wait on hold. Doctors aren't saints. We need to reflect the times we live in. A thoughtful middle-aged surgeon recently described his view of the ethos of management emerging from physicians as "it's all about me." He told me that their interest in lifestyle immunities may begin with restrictions and training hours. Although well-intended, it does interrupt continuity of care and learning firsthand about how diseases and treatments progress. That gets in the way of commitment, he says. But do new doctors really perform poorly as a result, I asked. I had trouble believing that. My surgeon friend thought hard and answered no, but I think it's because they're specialising in narrower and narrower areas. Keeping up, maintaining income and preserving lifestyle all become easier that way. Narrow focus may even facilitate putting the patient first, but only in the narrow domain of that specialist. Doctoring ain't the broadest sense of the word. It's not facilitated. The odd thing about doctoring is how hard it is to accurately describe. It's probably a resistance to the capsule definition as obscene speech, an issue which preoccupied the Supreme Court for half a century. And if I can be permitted to be a bit literal in sense of the analogy, Judge Potter Stewart's comment that, however hard obscenity is to define, I know it when I see it, might equally well apply to a good doctoring. In fact, good doctoring is easier to spot when you lose it than while you have it. Perhaps that is why so often it's taken for granted. Of course, attitude and orientation can only do so much. Awareness of the sources of cognitive error can do a lot to make us better doctors. In my review in September of Dr. Jerome Groopman's book, How Doctors Think, I began to discuss cognitive errors, concentrating mainly on how we see what we expect to see rather than what is there. Patients who are familiar to us and those who are pre-labelled with a diagnosis present the greatest risk of prejudgment and consequent mistaken diagnosis. We also play the odds when we say that hoofbeats are more likely to suggest horses than zebras, but it's one thing to say that diagnosis A is more likely than diagnosis B, and quite another to actively resist making the less likely diagnosis, or at least keep it in mind. Instead, we seek diagnostic closure so we can move on. That leads us to be overly influenced by context, either what's going around or in the mix of similar cases we've recently seen, and then short shrift our examination of the present evidence. We risk fooling ourselves by prematurely concluding we've encountered more of the same. I use the inclusive we and us because studies have shown